everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar today on budgeting for security. We're very excited about this webinar. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the question pane, and we'll be answering questions at the end. And we will also be sending out a recorded copy of this webinar, and it will also be available on our website. So if you would like to access it once the webinar is over, you can do so from our website, and you can also direct all of your friends there. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Paul, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Robin. So I'm Paul Caiazzo. I'm one of the co-founders and also the Chief Security Architect of TruShield. I have about 16 years of security experience across a wide range of disciplines, largely dealing with strategic consulting at the CISO level. And of course, one of the things I get asked pretty continuously is how can I set up my budget to best support my cybersecurity initiatives? And that's actually a pretty significant challenge for most organizations. So, this webinar is intended to answer some of those questions and perhaps give you guys a little bit of homework in how to implement perhaps a more systematic methodology for developing a planned expenditure. I would appreciate it if anybody out there has questions, or you can feel free to either email me at the address that's on your screen, and also please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Thanks for that as well. So who is TruShield? We are a global cybersecurity company that's based in Washington, D.C. We divide our services up into two main practice areas, one professional services and one managed services. In the professional services arena, we do a lot of security consulting around the disciplines of architecture, governance, program development, program design, budget allocation, things like that. Of course, also we're very good at penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. On the managed security services side, we have a 24/7 security monitoring operation that we call continuous security monitoring, or CSM, through which we offer real-time managed SOC offering for companies in the financial industry, the legal industry, healthcare, e-commerce, and then also some large government institutions. So the agenda that I want to talk through today are, what are some of your budget drivers? What's really forcing you to spend on security? And what are some of the factors that you should be considering when you're thinking about your budget? What does a security program look like? What should be part of the capability set of any good security program? And then how can you take that information to help you determine what your budget should look like? I'm going to give you some information around how to quantitatively assess what your budget should be, and leave you guys with some equations you can use to help establish that base budget number, and then of course give you some guidance on what your budgetary priorities should ultimately be. So with that said, some of the budget drivers that I always try to coach my clients to be thinking about are really these things. And I think these are the high-level drivers that are going to be responsible for most of how you determine what you're going to be spending. So first and foremost, the regulatory environment could have a drastic impact on what your overall cybersecurity budget is going to be. Certain industries are very heavily regulated. Certain industries have no regulation. And in most cases, meeting those regulatory requirements, there's some costs associated with that. And those costs include things like control assessments, policy development. Perhaps you even have to go through a attestation or an actual audit from some governing body. There's significant costs associated with that, and that can have a drastic impact on what you're budgeting for cybersecurity. One thing I usually advise my clients to do is to treat their compliance and oversight program almost as a separate bucket of funds from their security operations. Really, security and compliance aren't exactly the same thing. Being compliant does not necessarily mean you're secure, and being secure does not necessarily mean that you're compliant. They do play kind of hand in hand. And in truth, a well-secured environment should be compliant, and compliance should be a byproduct of good security. But given the way certain regulations are constructed, it's something that you need to be mindful of. So bear that in mind as a separate bucket of funding. Additionally, you want to be considering your market position. And this is important because if your company is at the very top of your market, you're going to be a high-value target. And that being in that sort of limelight or with that sort of spotlight upon you means that not only are customers going to be looking at you as a viable option for business, but also the bad guys. They're going to be very heavily inspecting what you're doing on the internet. You may have a lot more attention placed upon you from those advanced persistent threats, or APTs, which you've probably read quite a bit about. And even if you're not on the radar of some APT, the fact that if you are at the top of your market, you're very large, you probably have a very significant risk surface. And what I mean by that is ways or means by which the bad guys could get into your network, either through things like phishing or even through actual network penetration. So that's an important thing. If you're maybe mid-market or lower, you should also be considering cybersecurity as a potential competitive advantage for you. There's a lot of business that we're seeing being written, especially in like the law firm space or insurance space, where having a strong cybersecurity program has helped win business. And so if you're mid-market and competing against some of the larger companies, you should actually look at cybersecurity as not necessarily just a cost center, but also potentially a revenue driver. It really depends upon what business you're in, but it's something that at least should be in the frame for consideration as you're thinking about this stuff. Of course, industries is another very important aspect of this. Certain industries are less interconnected than others from a security standpoint, and so it's probably less of a priority. For the majority of companies nowadays, though, everything is interconnected, and it's hard to operate in a global scale without having some sort of interconnectivity between your different systems. That interconnectivity bears risk, and if you think about different types of industries that probably have higher security concerns, it generally is pretty well aligned with the regulated industries. There are a couple of outliers there. So the regulated industries are, your financial industry, obviously the government or any sort of government service providers, healthcare associations, anybody that processes a payment card that has to deal with PCI, and there's a variety of others. So those are your regulated industries. The unregulated industries don't have those specific concerns, but they do have some security requirements, and I'm thinking specifically of law firms in this case. Law firms, they're not truly a regulated industry from a cybersecurity standpoint. They do have some requirements in the American Bar Association for exercising reasonable care over client data, which we'll actually be talking about in a future webinar, but that they don't necessarily have a regulation specific to them. What they do have are those client mandates that are coming from the clients that operate in those regulated industries. So of course, industry is going to be a driver for what your overall spend on cybersecurity is going to be. Mostly because that's also going to be a major influencer on the types of data and the types of transactions that your organization is going to be processing. You may have a lot of financial data that you're processing. You may have PCI implications there simply by virtue of doing business on the internet. You almost certainly have some PII in your environment, PII being personally identifiable information. At the very minimum, you almost certainly have your employees' personally identifiable information. And so that information must be protected, and that's your duty of care as the employer to protect the sensitive information that you have on your own employees. And that doesn't even take into account your customers. And so you've got to be thinking about what sort of data resides in your network, what sort of sensitivities are associated with that, and then how you're transacting business, not just with your customers, but also how you're transacting with even your employees and also your third-party business associates. The other thing to think about here, and this also ties back to industry, is intellectual property. If you have any sort of proprietary technology or even proprietary information about, for instance, a particular client that you've invested in developing that intellectual property, there's value to that some malicious actor could be targeting. Especially if you're towards the top of your industry and you have intellectual property, you're almost certainly on the crosshairs of some APT that's in the middle of an espionage operation. We see that quite a bit emanating from the Far East, specifically from China. We see a lot of the industrial espionage sort of attacks. And the reason for that is because they're trying to short-circuit that research and development lifecycle and get directly to go-to-market. So if you have a significant investment in research and development or in intellectual property, that's information you better be paying attention to the protection of. Lastly, on this slide, audit findings. So this, again, deals specifically with regulated industries. If you have a hard compliance mandate that you must meet, you almost certainly also have auditors that come in to inspect how well compliant you are with your regulations. And those audits never come back perfectly clean. I've never seen one that says you won the internet for the day. It's always you've got some problem that you've got to go and fix, and that's perfectly valid. There's basically nobody that has a perfectly secure environment, and so the audit findings that you get back are going to be big influence on your overall budget. If you have significant or material weaknesses in key areas that are going to prohibit you from achieving compliance, that could be a business viability sort of scenario where the auditor basically shuts you down because you're no longer in compliance with your regulation. So cleaning up audit findings, a lot of times budget is dedicated specifically to that. And if you had a particularly bad year from the audit perspective, your budget this year may be bigger than what it was the prior year or in subsequent years. So these are the things to be thinking about as you're thinking about overall budgetary concerns and how I need to be framing the budget that I bring to my board. Next we're going to talk about the security program. So we have an idea of what the budget drivers are going to be. The security program is where we start thinking about what are the capabilities that I need to be implementing and how how I should be positioning myself from a security standpoint, from an operational standpoint, so that budget is well allocated and that I'm actually getting value out of the spend. So we like to coach our clients to think about security operations in four main areas: prevention, detection, containment, and eradication, or sometimes called response. So prevention, you really want to be thinking about all of those security controls that could prevent the worst from happening. So I'm thinking specifically about your firewalls, perhaps an intrusion prevention system, antivirus, anti-malware, perhaps data loss prevention, anything that can stop a data breach from occurring or stop a compromise from happening. That's the prevention bucket. The detection bucket is kind of the insurance policy for prevention. Knowing that we can never be perfect with respect to preventing all attacks and all compromises, what we then must do is ensure that we've adequately spent and adequately positioned ourselves to be able to detect those compromises when they happen. So I'm thinking specifically of things like next generation firewalls, which have quite a bit of threat detection capability built into them, managed services that do specifically threat intelligence and threat monitoring. Also things like IDSs, intrusion detection systems. You also have host-based intrusion detection systems which can pick up indicators of compromise on endpoints. There's a whole stack of technologies that fall under that detection category, and that's an area that if I had to coach a client to think specifically about one area to spend more in, it would be in detection, knowing that the statistics and the likelihood of compromise are not really on our favor, and so we've got to be doing as much as we can to detect bad things as quickly as we possibly can so that we can then move into containment and eradication. So containment, there's a number of things that fall into the containment bucket, and a lot of it actually deals with security architecture when I talk about containment. I think the best containment strategy that I see implemented is network segmentation at a very granular level. So applying constructs around different parts of your organization so that traffic, that maybe if you have a malware breakout in your accounting department, it doesn't impact your operations department, and you can shut down that segment of the network very quickly if you detect that something actually has happened that you failed to prevent. So containment can be a very important area of your budget, and it's usually something that is foundational. That will require thought well in advance and setting yourself up to be able to move into a containment sort of mode when the worst does happen. And then of course eradication or incident response. You need to have the right resources on staff and the right technologies on staff to be able to clean up those sorts of malware outbreaks when they happen. Also included in here, you've got to be thinking about things like breach notifications. And so if you have some customer data which gets breached, you'll then have to notify them, and that's at least something you should be planning for. A lot of times that ends up coming into the budget as an insurance line item, where cyber insurance can help pay for breach notification, things like that. The one thing I will say is that cyber insurance is definitely a critical part of your budget. However, it is absolutely not a replacement for adequate budget and budget allocation across these other categories here. In fact, they must go hand in hand. I've seen many insurance claims be rejected because there was not adequate attention paid to prevention, detection, containment, and eradication. So with that said, where do you begin? And what I usually coach our clients to think about is, where are we at right now? What does my security posture look like today, and how can I identify those major capability gaps? And the best way to do that is really to take a look at some framework, or if you're in a regulated industry, take a look at those regulations which stipulate what you must be doing. But assess yourself against that. Don't wait for the auditor to come and tell you where your gaps are. Perform a self-assessment. Or contract a third-party subject matter expert to come in and perform an unbiased assessment for you, and that perhaps is even better, because if you assess yourself, unfortunately, we're all biased, to what we've personally implemented, what we've personally done, and an outside a party is going to not have that bias, and will also have the benefit of having had seen many, many different organizations and many different implementations that are designed to meet some compliance mandate. So that capability gap assessment is going to have a very big influence on how not just you establish a bottom line number for your budget, but how you move forward in allocating that budget. And it's really going to be designed to address the biggest risks first. And that's something we always recommend to our clients. Even if you do a simple vulnerability scan against your environment, you don't want to start with the low severity findings first. You want to start with what's going to impact your business the most first. And the same would be true for a capability gap assessment. If you note during your gap assessment that you have some controls in place for prevention and detection, but your network is not set up well to be able to contain a malware outbreak, that's a pretty significant risk. There's also significant expenditures that are associated with re-architecting a network. So in that case, you may elect to spend more on the containment strategy for the next budget cycle, and then worry about prevention and detection enhancements the following budget cycle. But you really need to focus on what are the biggest risks first. And that's another area where a third-party subject matter expert can help, but that's really got to be done collaboratively with you. And the reason for that is that it's entirely reliant upon an adequate business impact analysis having been done. It's not really possible for me to look at the results of a gap assessment and totally blind tell you what the biggest risk to your business is. That business impact assessment has to be done, and there has to be some institutional knowledge about how your organization operates and what is the most critical asset or critical process that has to be secured. And that institutional knowledge is going to definitely come from your side and should be collaboratively approached with the third-party assessment organization that's doing it for you. So when you think about determining your budget, there are many different aspects of it that you need to actually consider. So we talked about those 4 different capability stacks. To actually fill out those areas, the prevention, containment, detection, and eradication, there are many different things that fall into each of those categories. Things that you have to be considering are obviously hardware, things like security appliances, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, perhaps a DDoS mitigation appliance if you're, again, a high-value target in a high-transaction sort of industry. Storage infrastructure is something that you really need to be mindful of when you think about hardware for your security stack. Storage infrastructure can actually be a very significant cost when you start looking at things like log management and an adequate monitoring strategy for your SIM or your security incident, security information event management. If you need to maintain logs for any sort of compliance requirement, usually that's three months online and 1 year in cold storage or offline. In some industries, that's 7 years offline. And I can tell you, as an organization that operates managed security operations center, storage is a significant component of your budget. So you need to be definitely mindful of that. And the best way to do that is take a look at the number of devices in your organization, get an average events per second estimate for those types of devices, and then kind of work from there to develop an idea for how much storage you're going to require over the next budget year. And then start putting that stuff in place via a storage appliance, usually a storage area network that can be shared by multiple different resources and not necessarily just security. That's a good way to look at that. Obviously also, I talked earlier about containment strategies relying upon network architecture. So if you do have to budget for any sort of network architecture or enhancements of any kind, network equipment is generally not inexpensive, especially if you go for some of the, the more advanced technology which can really embed security at the hardware level within your network, it's usually not cheap, and it's something that you need to be thinking about from a budgetary perspective very early in the process. On the software side, there are many different software applications that could comprise, a security taxonomy or a set of tools that are within your toolkit. Thinking specifically of things like antivirus and anti-malware. Likely that if you're listening to this, you probably already have antivirus and anti-malware. If you don't, and I do mean both of those, antivirus and anti-malware, that's an area that you really should be looking at quickly. That will help from a prevention and a detection standpoint. There are other technologies, other softwares that you need to be looking at as well. You should certainly be looking at web filtration, so that content filters sort of approach to what sites and what sort of content your users can get to on the internet. And that can either actually, sometimes can be a hardware appliance or software. There are different ways to do that. Same is true of email filtration. There are hardware appliances and there are software approaches to solving that, but that can help eliminate things like phishing attacks at your network edge, or eliminate malware that could come in through email at the network edge before it even gets to your users, and that's obviously desirable. Additionally, if you have any sort of either personally identifiable information, payment card information, or any sensitive information, especially if you have any kind of mobile workforce, people have laptops that they travel with, you need to be thinking about hard drive level encryption for your devices. And that's software that you're going to need to budget for, because it's not, there are some that are available via the operating system providers, but they still do have costs associated with them. And the best, which are centrally manageable, are they're not inexpensive. Lastly, the thing I'll talk about on software side is the SIM itself, the Security Information and Event Management System. This is an absolutely critical component of your security stack, and it's going to power basically everything from that capability stack I talked about earlier. It's going to help you prevent some threats if it's architected correctly. It's going to certainly help you detect if it's architected correctly. It can help you contain if you have the right information in it, and also it can certainly help with the response and eradication component as well. There are many different kinds of SIMs, and they're lumped into three main categories: your enterprise class SIM, your log manager turned SIM, and then your data analytics turned SIM. But these tools at their core are designed to ingest information from your entire security stack, but also your entire technology environment, and help you produce actionable information out of what's happening in your environment right now, to give you situational awareness so that you can take action immediately if something bad does happen, or prevent those bad things from happening if you're able to act quickly enough. The best SIMs incorporate a threat intelligence component, where you can monitor for threat signatures via a very wide range of subscription sets, where you can hook into different threat feeds and learn about what's going on in the internet at large and help protect yourself. And that's a vital aspect of it. Additionally, the best SIMs enable you to ingest vulnerability information. And vulnerability scanning is also software you need to be considering as part of your security stack. Both SIM and vulnerability management, and in fact some of the other softwares and hardwares I talked about, are often available through a managed security services provider. And if you're looking at ways to allocate your budget wisely over a period of several budget years, you might want to consider a managed security services provider, because it can help remove some of the major capital expenditures of those security appliances and of those softwares, and transfer those costs over to operational expenses. And that's actually a very good way of achieving a high level of capability pretty quickly. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the other things to be considering, and actually goes hand in hand with that discussion about managed security services, are operations and maintenance. So you've bought the best tools, you've bought the best hardware, you've installed it hopefully correctly. Now what? Now you've got to move into actually operating those tools in a manner which is constructive and is going to produce the intelligence that you hope to get out of it. And it's not really possible to do that if you just basically plug and play or set and forget sort of approach to cybersecurity. That simply doesn't work. The security environment is changing every day, every hour, every minute, and you really have to be diligent to keep up with what's going on there. And so you really do need to be budgeting for either full-time employees or some sort of operational partner that can help actually manage and maintain your security stack. Most people really don't realize how much it costs to operate and maintain their security programs, especially if you're looking at any sort of 24/7 operation. Most of our clients that have looked at implementing 24/7 security monitoring, they're kind of not prepared for the logistical challenge that comes with operating a 24/7 operation. And that's, again, an area where a managed security services provider like TruShield can help. Additionally, you of course, from a governance and from a regulatory compliance standpoint, you need to have the right policies in place. And those policies are going to flow from what your regulation is. The policy needs to be designed to meet the rigors of the regulation, and then the actual implementation of those policies has to follow with the right hardware, software, operations, and maintenance. You need to have the right sort of people designing those policies as well, and usually that's not something I usually recommend clients do in a vacuum, because a policy that's written specifically for one organization, maybe it works for you, but it's better to not reinvent the wheel there and to leverage the expertise and experience of a seasoned subject matter expert that's done a lot of policy development. Can help overcome some pitfalls where security can kind of get in the way of operations. I'm sure everybody's encountered that in the past, and that's an unfortunate side effect of not adequately considering the practicality of your security policies before you try to implement them. Of course, there's always intangibles. Stuff changes. There may be a new security technology that comes out tomorrow that's the absolute bee's knees, and that's a intangible that's difficult to predict, difficult to forecast. And so what I generally recommend from an intangible standpoint is to add 20% to what you estimate your budget to be, and that will hopefully account for intangibles, schedule slippages, and costs that you were not expecting. So with that, I want to step into some quantitative analysis. So we've talked a lot about qualitative stuff, but what about some actual numbers here? This is very important to do so that you have an idea of scenarios that are likely to hit your organization from a risk perspective. And it's important to do this just from a disaster recovery planning or a continuity of operations planning sort of program. You need to start with that business impact assessment. What are the most critical things that my business absolutely needs to operate in order to keep the business running? And that's a very important thing to do, even not just from a budgetary standpoint, but from a risk management standpoint. If you in the audience have not performed a business impact assessment, formal business impact assessment, where you've gone through all of your information assets, all of your critical processes, and identified the importance of them and weighted them so that you can identify if, for instance, a vulnerability that affects some critical asset that has the right weighting and has the right sort of attention on it. It's a very important thing to do from a risk management strategy standpoint. So I highly recommend, if you haven't done that yet, you do it very soon. So the equation actually is scenario-based, and the downside to that is that it's not possible to predict every potential scenario that you might encounter. There are many different risks that could impact your business. The best thing to do is pull together a consortium of stakeholders within your business and try to identify what those likely scenarios are. Again, this is not something you do in a vacuum. One person really is not enough to do this, because you're not going to have a broad enough perspective on threats and what the criticality of different assets within your business are. Various stakeholders from across your organization are going to have different perspectives on what is critical and what isn't, and that's important to take into account when you start looking at your security budget. Because you, as the budget holder for the security stack, you need to be enabling all of those other stakeholders to securely operate their mission. Right? So accounting needs to be able to do what they need to do securely. Research and development needs to be able to do what they need to do securely, and you're the vehicle by which they can do that. So it's important to get their perspective when you think about that business impact assessment. So with that said, the equation that we're going to run through is this. We're going to look at what the single loss expectancy of any single incident is. So how much can I expect to lose if the worst happens once? Then we're going to assess that against what is the annual rate of occurrence. How frequently can I expect that bad thing to happen? And that is a multiplier that we're going to apply to arrive at the annual loss expectancy, or how much per year can I expect based upon statistics to lose if this particular scenario occurs. All right, so an example I'm going to give you for that is an earthquake. So we took the perspective of an earthquake will cost us $1 million to recover from, and the idea there being that it destroys our primary data center, and we've got to recover many different systems that are critical to our business. This is just an example, but it's one that you should probably assess against your own organization. Other examples you want to be thinking about are other natural disasters, fires, of course the data breach itself, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then anything else that's somewhat likely to happen or has such a significant impact that even if it's not super likely to happen, it's something you need to be planning for. And this actually is an example of that, right? This is not something that's very likely to happen to us, at least here in the Washington, D.C. area. However, if you're perhaps out in Los Angeles, this might be very likely to happen. So it's worthwhile to spend the time doing this. But here, we're going to estimate that the earthquake of a severe enough variety that can actually do the damage to us will happen once every 50 years. That once every 50 years gives it a 2% chance of happening in any 1 year. So what we're going to do is take that $1 million and we're going to apply a 0.02 or 2% of annual loss expectancy. And that is going to result in a $20,000 cost per year that you should be spending to protect yourself against an earthquake. Now, that might be an insurance policy. In fact, this is a very good example of where an insurance policy would make sense, because an organization such as TruShield might not, in this case, with a $20,000 expected loss, have a hot data center failover in a different geographical location strictly to solve this particular problem. We, of course, do have a hot data center in a separate geographic location because we have to operate at a very high availability level for our managed services clients, but it's not driven by this specific scenario. Again, you'll want to apply your own numbers to this in multiple different scenarios so that you can arrive at the aggregate score of what you should be spending on cybersecurity to protect yourself against these different scenarios. The other scenario I want to talk about is the actual data breach itself. So we took a look at some statistics with respect to what the average costs are for a data breach. The Ponemon Institute produced this $3.8 million average cost of a data breach for a large US-based company. $3.8 million cost for a data breach, and that includes all of the incident response, all of the data breach notification to the customers. It could include also some opportunity costs for lost revenues and lost business. But ultimately, it winds up at an average cost of $3.8 million for large US-based businesses. And some are many, many times. If you think about Target, for instance, that's a very high multiple of that number. Then we looked at, well, how frequently do we think a major data breach could occur at a large company? And so we looked at a data breach report from the ID Theft Center. And in that, there's a survey where large businesses were polled for what they felt the likelihood of a data compromise would be. And 34% of survey respondents there reported that they felt the data breach was very likely or inevitable. So given that, we took a somewhat conservative approach at reviewing that number and applied, instead of the 34%, 25% of large US-based companies. And according to the census, there's approximately 15,000 large US-based companies. So 30,750 of those expect some sort of data breach over the next year. That results in a 25% likelihood of a data breach in any one given year, which means that based upon the average loss expectancy budgetary numbers, your average large US-based company should be spending approximately $950,000 per year across their entire cybersecurity stack to protect themselves. So that's going to include all of the hardware, all of the software, all of the operations and maintenance, and some of the intangibles in there. And I would put the question to the audience, are you spending approximately that number? Perhaps not if you're positioned at not quite the large business organization level, but this is something you need to be thinking about from a planning and quantitative perspective. The other way to look at this is the law of averages. On average, we see about 11% of IT budget spent on cybersecurity at large businesses. Small businesses actually spend percentage-wise more on IT security than large businesses, approximately 15% on cybersecurity. The thing I always like to remind my clients is that cybersecurity is not just an IT problem. So if you're looking at cybersecurity as a percentage of your IT budget, you may not be thinking big picture and not incorporating all of those stakeholders that I talked about a little while ago that have different missions within your organization that all must be supported from a security standpoint. It's not necessarily all just IT. You've got to think about things like environmental protections, and by that I mean like even the physical locks on doors, stuff like that. Usually does not come out of an IT budget. Would come out of a larger security budget. And also this is somewhat endemic of an organization where the security team reports up to the CIO. And I don't always recommend that that be the case because that will leave the security team with the inherent biases of the CIO shop. If you have to report to the CIO that the CIO's plan or architecture is inadequate for security, that may be a difficult conversation to have. And so if the CISO, in fact, reports outside of that chain, a lot of times that can be more effective. So again, these are average numbers, what we see, and you should be applying that to your own IT budget to come up with a back-of-the-envelope guess as to what you should be spending on cybersecurity. But please do bear in mind, cybersecurity is larger than just an IT problem. The next thing that you want to consider is prioritizing that spend. So we talked earlier about prevention, detection, containment, and response. And so what we recommend that you do is perform that quantitative analysis on each section. So think about what a shortfall in your prevention capabilities would cost you from a single loss expectancy, from an annual rate of occurrence, and an annual loss expectancy perspective. Do that math, and that's going to help you understand where your biggest risks lie. That capability gap is going to really drive where you spend your money first, and that's really important so that we all have limited budgets to work with, and you're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do in any one budget cycle. But what you really need to do is be able to smartly spend that money to have the maximum impact on your organization, and this is how you do that. So please take the time to do that math and map out some scenarios against a well-executed business impact analysis to help you make those informed decisions about how to spend that money to protect yourselves. That analysis is really going to be vital for you in making the right decisions on that prevention, detection, containment, and response budget allocation. The next thing that I want to talk about is MSSPs. So I mentioned earlier that security technologies usually bear with them very significant capital expenses. Your average security information event management system, or SIM, can cost $100,000. Some are very, very much more than that. Security appliances like firewalls and IDSs, especially your next generation stuff, those are not inexpensive devices. And so there's significant capital expenditure you've got to be planning for. Usually you're going to have to stage that out over several budget cycles. And what that means is that's going to leave you with capability gaps for several budget cycles. Could be years before you can adequately fill all those gaps. And MSSP can help you fill those gaps much quicker because rather than produce that large capital expenditure at one time, the MSSP is going to enable you to have access to that best-of-breed advanced technology in an operational expense sort of paradigm. And so you're basically amortizing the costs of those security appliances and security technologies out over the life of that engagement. And not just that, but you're also getting the operations and maintenance directly from subject matter experts. So that's not logistics you've got to worry about. That's not personnel you've got to worry about. It's not training and retention that you've got to worry about either. So it can be a very effective strategy to helping organizations achieve a high security environment, advanced security posture very, very quickly and a much lower cost overall because usually the MSSP is going to apply some economies of scale so that effectively you're not buying the whole solution. You're buying a slice of it, or at least you're paying for a slice of it, but you're getting the whole solution. And I hope that makes sense. But with that said, that's the end of my presentation here. Obviously, you've still got to pay some attention to that prevention component, but how much effort you should be spending on prevention, detection, containment, and eradication are things that you need to be considering as well. So I guess with that said, I'm going to open the floor to questions. And okay, it looks like we've got a couple here. So the first question I've got is, how often do you need to evaluate your detection, containment, and eradication process to make sure it's working? Well, that's pretty good. So if you're thinking about that, how frequently do you have to do it? So if we're in the context of a budget discussion, generally budgets are aligned once per year, where you're going to estimate what you need to spend for the next calendar year or next fiscal year. But I think if you take an annual snapshot against this stuff, it's probably insufficient. I would say you at least want to be doing a quarterly checkpoint against each of these areas at a very high level. But I think the best recommendation I could give you there is, in fact, this is kind of a continuous evaluation process across your security stack. You need to be monitoring metrics across each of these capabilities to determine how well they're performing, and that's going to enable you to be adaptable to changing circumstances. And that kind of fits that intangibles bucket. So if you see mid-year that you're kind of languishing from a containment and eradication standpoint, then perhaps you take some of that discretionary funds and put towards shoring up that capability. We actually ran a webinar a few months ago where we talked about security metrics and how to measure performance and how to assess how well your security organization is doing. So I would suggest that Chris take a look at that webinar to get some more direct answers to that question. Okay, so the last question that looks like I've got here is, how do you quantify probability of certain risks for your geographical region, e.g. earthquakes? Is there a definitive source that you can recommend? That's a tough question to answer. For things like disasters, natural disasters, I think you could probably look at perhaps like a geological survey or NOAA or like hurricanes and things like that. In terms of definitive sources, I don't think I've got one specific for earthquakes or that sort of thing. It's got your perspective's got to be kind of broad-based, so that you're looking at not just the natural disasters. Those are really important to be planning for, but you also need to be thinking about how how cyber risks could impact your organization above and beyond just natural disasters. They're certainly important to be mindful of, but think about those and think about how even something like a fire can impact you. And there's definitely no definitive source that we could recommend for how frequently your data center may catch on fire. Hopefully never. Okay, and then it looks like I got one more question with how much effort should be spent on prevention, how much on containment, how much on detection, how much on eradication. So basically, what percentage of my spend should I allocate to each of those 4 buckets? That's a good question. And unfortunately, it's not really possible for me to give you a, spend X% on each of those. There are those drivers that I talked about earlier are really going to be major influencers here. If you're a high-value target that is at the top of its industry, or a large business that works in some potential industry where you're interacting with the public at large, you're going to have a target on your head, and that means that you should be certainly spending on detection, so that the stuff that does slip through the fishnet, because it's going to slip through, you're not going to be perfect from a prevention standpoint. You're picking that stuff up. So generally, I would say I would weight the expenditure towards detection and eradication, simply because our mantra as a cybersecurity company is that it's not possible to prevent every compromise from impacting your organization. What you want to do, though, is make sure that you can immediately detect when Susie goes out to Facebook and accidentally downloads a piece of malware. You know when that happens, the instant it happens, so that single device compromise, Susie's laptop, does not result in a data breach. There's a big difference between a minor compromise and a data breach, and the difference is how quickly you can detect, contain, and eradicate them. Unlikely that you would necessarily be able to prevent that unless you've got things like the web filtration I talked about earlier, or a good intrusion prevention system. But even then, it's not possible to prevent everything because there's new stuff being developed every day, and a lot of that stuff relies upon known signatures. And so if it's a new threat that there's not a signature developed for yet, you're not going to be able to prevent it. But what you definitely want to be able to do is pick up that change in behavior for that device So you might pick up the beaconing traffic out to command and control node and be able to contain and eradicate it right then and there. So again, if I had to give some guidance, I would say I would allocate a little bit more towards detection, containment, and eradication, because most organizations have implemented the prevention stuff like firewalls and anti-malware and antivirus. It's a good question, though. Any other questions? Okay, doesn't look like it. So with that said, I would of course invite any of the attendees to visit our website for information about what it is that we do. We also produce a number of informational resources that you can subscribe to look at what threats are we seeing in the wild on any given day, or our monthly State of the Union Cyber Intelligence Report, which will break down region by region of what threats we're seeing emanating from particular parts of the world and how they're impacting specific industry verticals. And also, if you have questions, again, I'd invite you to please reach out to me either via email or via LinkedIn. And of course, you can feel free to give us a call if you have any specific questions.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. As Paul said, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to him. You can also use the Contact Us form on TruShield's website. And I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar today, and we hope to see you on future webinars.